Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to everybody for coming. This is great. I'm looking forward to your responses and your questions. So, let me try to start here at the beginning. What I'd like to do is to kind of three things. I'm going to begin with kind of an overview of what I see as sort of the scientific problem, or the historical problem, I should say. And that is I'm going to call it the disappearance and then rediscovery of animal emotions as a scientific subject in the United States. This isn't a story, I hate to disappoint, a story directly about animals, but rather about, I guess I'll call it the construction of academic disciplines, which are humanly constructed in that sense, that study animals. Certainly, though, as I'll say in a minute, there are animals involved. I then want to really briefly kind of lay out what my historical argument is. I'm not so sure that I need to lay it out in great depth because it is a historical argument, probably of more interest to professionals who are historians. So I'm going to kind of soft pedal that and then return to some of the highlights of the historical transformation itself, including World War I as a kind of transformational moment, the role of wives and adult children in the science itself, the European-American relationship, scientific relationship that really helped to shape the science, including emigre scientists in the United States, and then a rising interest in animal emotions. I feel more confident about my start date of 1890. 1980 is selected as, it's not quite random, but something happens in the 1970s, and there is a resurgence, a real resurgence, although I argue it's a gradual transformation in the previous decades. If we start with the introductory slide itself, I think there are a couple of things to see here in the image of Leonard Carmichael, who was a psychologist, but at this time in the 1950s had become the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. You can see a couple things, though, in the picture that underline some of the fundamental principles that I like to talk about. First of all, I think that the problem of animal emotions is about the relationship between the scientists and the animals. And I don't mean that in sort of a touchy-feely way, even though there is no doubt an emotional component, but it's also an intellectual component. In other words, the assumption made about animals. In other words, it's neither entirely about animals nor entirely about the science, but rather about the relationship. So I don't know who took it in their mind to dress the primates up and have him holding them, but basically you see him holding these animals. The second thing I'd like to say that you do see here, I hope too, is that the animals themselves were historical actors. They were never passive. In fact, I'm not going to argue, I don't have too much in this to talk about that, but basically I would argue that, and I've written an article about it, they drove the science forward. Emotionally, and they had moods, they had temperaments, and they had activities, and so they're not just, again, sort of a scientific subject. And again, these particular primates don't look particularly active, but basically, if nothing else, they're cute. And I do think that is part of this story. Finally, we see Carmichael wearing his three-piece suit, looking very natty. And you might think that he was nothing but an armchair scientist, that he never got dirty and down in the lab. But in fact, he had in the 1920s when he was a young professor at Princeton. He went out to neighboring ponds and picked up salamander embryos. And did various things with them. So there was a time in his life before he was the secretary of the Smithsonian that he was not looking quite so natty. But the reason I mentioned the three-piece suit is that basically, I'm Carmichael. I can't tell scientists whether animals have emotions or not. I've read a lot of historical studies and the literature, et cetera, but basically I can talk about the history, I can talk about the disciplines, I can talk about the literature, but I can't determine the science. I can't design an experiment, I can't reach scientific conclusions. So again, I'm not dirty down in the pond in that sense. I'm not really wearing my three-piece suit, but again, metaphorically, I am. So let me go to the next slide. I got interested actually in the problem of emotion in American, I'm going to say psychology. One of the things I will talk about is sort of the migration of this subject from the field of psychology to the field of biology. And that will come up again. But I got interested in it because I kept running into kind of caveats or comments like you see Robert Yerkes, who'll show up again, first a Harvard professor and then eventually went to Yale. But this comes from a textbook he wrote in 1911, and the gist of the quotation is that understanding emotions are behind. You know, we haven't progressed enough to understand emotions. We're much better at understanding perception, and he calls it ideation. That might today be called cognition. This is not an isolated kind of comment, and so I began to think, and I didn't start this project focused on animals. I started focused on emotion. I wanted to know why these early psychologists felt that they could not master, they couldn't say really too much about emotion. But he here pitches this essentially as progressive. In other words, we haven't gotten there yet, but we're going to get there later. I would argue that, in fact, this kind of intellectual, I'm going to call it disappearance of emotion, as a scientific subject was something new. In other words, earlier generations felt confident that they knew what animal emotions and emotion in general was. And then this first generation, really underlying that, the first generation of American experimental psychologists and to a lesser extent biologists felt that they didn't know. So what had happened? Where had it gone? In fact, these illustrations underline that the early, again, psychologists were really focused on, they were focused on intelligence. And intelligence, though, understood in a specific way, and that is gradual habit formation. I think that in some ways, learning is another kind of word that one would pull up to describe what they were focused on. These are neither the old-fashioned ideas of, say, John Locke from the 18th century, where you had perceptions and they formed ideas. I would say this kind of cognitive, I'll call it psychology, is also not like modern cognitive psychology. It's really very specific about gradually learning to master skills. It's about skill acquisition in that sense, which of course is still around too. But they meant something very narrow. Why did the first American psychologists focus on this? One could argue that this was the kind of can-do, psychology that was useful in a society that wanted to move forward. It made sense, it was controllable, and it, in that sense, was characteristically American. There are scholars out there who have made that argument, that argue, in fact, that Americans are still obsessed with intelligence as opposed to other aspects of personality. But for whatever reason, this is the early dominant mode, and again, emotion sort of goes by the board. Let me see what else I wanted to say about that. First of all, and then note, though, that it really is in the field of psychology. I think one of the things that I've been intrigued by, and of course, I'm learning on my feet constantly, is I'm moving. I had to move from anything having to do with the history of psychology, about which I'd written something, to the history of biology, about which I knew virtually nothing. and so there is this migration in disciplines, not to say that it's total, et cetera, but note that this is psychology. Just to say something finally about what were these experiments, and I'm sure these are all quite famous, so a lot of you know exactly what they were. But the earliest ones were not mazes, not rats in a maze, but actually puzzle boxes. And this was designed by, as you can see, Edward Thorndike. Either the animal had to get into the box and figure that out, or to get out of the box. But basically, there was that task, and that gradually it was assumed that the animal would be able to figure it out. But it's very mental in its focus. And if you want to, look a little more closely, I've actually, of course, worked with all this stuff. And I only noticed a little while ago that if you look in the box on the right, you can actually see the cat. Okay, just to point out the animal here, there's the cat, right? Sort of visible. These intelligence experiments over time became increasingly elaborate. They were elaborate in a variety of ways. They tested animals who, for lack of a better word, I'm going to say were more advanced on an evolutionary scale. They were no longer looking, some of the early experiments actually focused on amphibians and all kinds of different, all kinds of animals, but basically they move in the direction of more sophisticated animals. I hate to use that word, but in the direction of primates, among other things. The tasks were also more complicated. For example, this is not a primate task. Yerkes, again, this comes from Yerkes. I did some experiments before 1915 and not in this location where he tested pigs and crows. And what he was asking them to do was not simply get in and out of the box, but rather to learn sequencing, which is actually, I'm sure people still do these experiments, very interesting. In other words, he would ask a pig to learn, every other. In other words, behind every other door there would be food, and can the pig learn that pattern, or the first door on the left, or the last door on the right? So the kinds of tasks were more sophisticated. The reason I include these pictures, though, is really to show you that the structures themselves and the experiments themselves became very elaborate and actually also very costly. And I don't think cost drove all of this, but it's good to realize that there were critics of these increasingly large and elaborate experiments. In fact, what Yerkes wants to do, because he is quite an evolutionary thinker, he wants to test every organism all the way up the evolutionary scale. So he had actually started pretty low in that sense. And had moved up to primates. But it's a kind of a life-consuming, if not multiple life-consuming task. And one of the people who was critical of this was Carl Lashley, another psychologist, who wrote a really interesting essay in 1918 called A Simple Maze. And he made an interesting argument in it. He basically said, learning is learning is learning. You don't need to, build a gigantic cage for primates. If you have a rat and you've got the rat in a maze and you devise some clever experiments, you're going to learn just as much about learning as if you're going to do this. So there were critics out there. But I guess I'm gonna watch the time and not say everything I want to say about these things too. But there were critics of this. There were also, I would say, that the focus on intelligence is to some extent in the eyes of the beholder. It's fascinating that the person who actually provided Yerkes with these primates, and there were only 3 of them, this other guy whose name is G.V. Hamilton, much more minor figure, studied exactly the same primates. And what did he study? He studied sexuality. And Yerkes actually denied that they even, that he said, no, they're not masturbating, they don't really have sexuality. He's so focused on intelligence. And I use that only because, that is an example, only because he really was focused on intelligence. And the majority were very focused on intelligence. But the experiments in that sense were in a way in the eyes of the beholder. I would say finally, though, that from the get-go, again, the animals exert a presence. And in this case, if I remember correctly, there were only 3 primates who were studied. It was hard. This is early. First of all, it's during the war. It was hard to get, primates to study. But they had different temperaments. And if you read this book, you'll see that some of them were better workers than others. And Yerkes had quite a work ethic. The number of trials for the animals was horrendous, like 700-800 trials, not so much for the primates, but for some of, the pigs. They would have to do a task hundreds of times. But basically, some of them were slackers. And so from the get-go, temperament, or in that sense, emotion, I'm going to move towards sort of a definition of emotion in a minute, or at least a working definition of emotion. Temperament really affected the experiments from the beginning. And in some ways, what I believe and argue, at least in one place, is that, the animals themselves bring back emotion as the subject. I mean, you can point to a whole lot of other factors, but the animals were really foundational. So in terms of the great forgetting, if that's, the question, where had emotion gone? And if one goes back, say, a generation, Darwin is a great example. Darwin wrote a foundational book, as you can see, in 1872, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Darwin was confident, I would say, that he knew what emotion was, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. But basically, there is, in a way, a loss of certainty and scientific, if I can say it, focus on emotion that happens over this generation. Part of it is, again, the American focus, and alternatively on intelligence. But okay, so talk for a minute about what did Darwin think? He thought two things. There are two things to look at in the title and in the illustration. First of all, in the title, the really crucial word is expression. He believed that emotion, and he was very much in the norm, for this period for scientists and philosophers alike. So he can be the sort of normative figure. He believed that emotion was something subjective or personal or inward, and that it would be expressed. And how would it be expressed? It would be expressed in postures. You can see the dog. I don't know, he's thinking the dog is going to be humble. That's a humble posture, which is sort of true. I could have dogs. But then in humans, you would have facial expression. And again, today psychologists still credit and look at these kinds of expressions, but basically believed it was something interior that was expressed outwardly. Not everybody agreed. William James, the premier and earliest American non-experimental psychologist, wrote an essay around 1880 in which he said, no, emotion is something that we feel in our bodies do something, and then our minds recognize it. In other words, it was going in the opposite direction, but Darwin is far more the norm. The other thing to see here, though, is that Darwin believed that creatures on the evolutionary scale had emotions. So that if a dog had an emotion and human beings had emotion, they weren't necessarily all the same, but basically that throughout I'll call it the animal kingdom, that there were going to be emotions. So this is essentially the previous generation in that sense. There's a lot going on in this slide, probably too much, so I'm not going to talk about all aspects of it, but I want to say a couple of things. I want to amplify a little bit, I think, other reasons why emotion in that sense early on drops from sight. The first reason, it seems to me, is utterly practical, and that if you want two quotations, I'm not going to talk about this one, but I want to say Margaret Floyd Washburn wrote a much reprinted, in fact, book called The Animal Mind in 1908. It was reprinted 4 times, so it's very popular. It's a textbook. And here she says, if we assume, and well, she doesn't say this, but if we assume that there's an element of subjectivity, of an immediate awareness of consciousness, whatever that is, that goes into having an emotion, that emotion is not simply, my body, my physiology, but it's also an awareness. There's a problem in the sense of studying probably anybody else. I can't tell you what your emotions are because I can never get inside you in that sense. And well, the problem for animals is far more profound. In other words, at least you can ask a human being, how are you feeling? But for an animal, you certainly can't do it. Of course, Washburn's answer to this was you can still study the emotions, but basically, but there's also, well, you can still study the emotions, but she recognized this as a problem. If you say that emotion here my working definition, that there's a kind of an aspect of consciousness, of awareness. I don't want it, consciousness has a kind of a heavy connotation, but an immediate awareness that goes into emotion. There was also a historical problem. And that is that, as some of you know, the early psychologists wanted to get rid of the notion of consciousness altogether. John B. Watson, being probably the most famous, argued that it's a fiction, to just say there's something called a consciousness is a fiction. He wanted to make the science strictly empirical. He wanted to be able to observe observe behaviors and to call them something. So he wanted to get rid of anything that was speculative, that was not observable, that was hidden in that sense. And I think part of the reason that emotion disappears because American psychology was so incredibly focused on empiricism. One of the things that disappears is emotion. In other words, there are kind of a confluence of factors that go into this, but basically the loss or the disregard, if I can say it, of subjectivity, of consciousness, of immediate experience is certainly part of it. So let me pause there, and then I've got it hugely written in my notes in big letters. If nothing else, I think it's important to remember that throughout the period that I'm talking about, American, probably biology as well, American life sciences, but certainly American psychology was very, very, very devoted, as you may all know, to empiricism. And so my argument becomes, well, you know, empiricism in some ways marginalizes the study of emotion, and certainly the study of emotion in animals. But basically, by doggedly, sort of decade after decade, observing animals in an empirical way, the emotions are rediscovered because something like emotion is actually out there. So here my example, and I know you really can't read this, not a very good illustration, a famous 1969 article by Frank Beach called humorously Locks and Beagles. If you know anything about beagle sex and dog sex, you'll know what that means. If you don't, I'm not going to explain it. But basically, yeah, well, you could go down that road, but I think that's probably not a very good idea. He does not celebrate emotion, but I would argue, in effect, in essence, he is describing emotion. He says that the beagles have a, quote, system of preference in terms of choosing their mates. This is an individual preference. He posits individuality to the beagles. And it's effective. There's no question that they're having sort of preferences. And so this chart, which comes out of the article, you know, again, not so important, but basically he tabulated how long they had sex and who was choosing whom, and you know, there are all these experiments. So my argument, my historical argument, is that you rediscover, or they rediscovered, emotion simply because they were so committed to empiricism. Which is pretty simple. And it may sound like a simple argument, but probably not without the possibility of being contested. It really raises important questions about the relationship, I think, between theory and empirical work. But, you know, that's kind of another topic. I had to pick out some people, just as I always tell my students, hang on to some basic facts. And so I have a lot of people I've worked on, but I chose as a sort of start point and end point these two individuals because they're convenient, and actually also they're utterly fascinating, and both of them have marvelous collections of papers. I was only apparently the second person ever to read the Donald Griffin papers at the Rockefeller Archive Center this summer. They've just been opened, and they're really fabulous. But why choose these people as sort of the historical, the beginning point and kind of the end point? again, Yerkes I've talked about a little bit. Yes, in 1911 in his textbook, he uses the word consciousness, but as a scientist, he was a huge advocate of what I'm going to call, again, experimentation and empiricism. He wrote in 1904, he was advising other colleagues of his in an article. He said, experiment much and speculate little. And that really became certainly his orthodoxy, and to the extent that he was influential, the orthodoxy of the field. Donald Griffin in some ways comes out of that tradition. I'm not going to talk about him at length, but his doctoral dissertation was on bats. They were kind of conventional. He was the student of Carl Lashley, who was a pretty straight arrow in terms of being an empiricist at Harvard, and this G.W. Pierce was actually a physicist, but he would cover either close the mouth with like tape or cover or plug the ears of bats to find out how they navigated, and discovered eventually what he named in 1944, of all things, echolocation. But he was really a strict empiricist. He did these neat experiments. If you read the early articles, they're fascinating. There are all these bats sort of flying around rooms, and he's very down to earth. In 1976, he published a book that pretty much all of his colleagues went, I can't believe you did that. Like, why did you say that? Called The Question of Animal Consciousness, and basically, bring back consciousness. So there is a kind of circle here, and I argue that emotion comes back with, with this return of consciousness. The argument in the book basically is that animals communicate. It's quite influenced, which I'll say at the end, by European thinking. But animals communicate with each other, whether it would be a social insect like a bee, because they dance and they tell other bees where things are, where food is, or whatever. But his inference was, if animals communicate, they must have consciousness. So it's a pretty simple argument, but there is this kind of turning around, that's very dramatic over this period of time. This is where I'm going to kind of rush through and not say too much, because there is a historical argument in here that seems a little, in some ways, tangential to the story I want to tell. I began to realize as I worked on this material that there is a kind of a larger argument. It's not just like, let's find animal emotions, but there's an argument about American science. And what is really at stake about American science is that it was creative, that empiricism went somewhere. There's a standard narrative, it seems to me, in the historical literature, that Americans were, and I'll talk about the quote in a minute, but that Americans were all behaviorists, and that European evolutionary theory comes along between the wars, that there is a nature-nurture war, that the Europeans correct American behaviorism, which is really focused exclusively on learning, and that Americans are sort of brought around to see that there's both I'm going to call it biological, it's not quite genetic, genetics was getting going, but basically the credit goes to the Europeans for having reintroduced evolution, for having reintroduced natural biological explanations as opposed to learning explanations. And I realized that what I had really discovered quite by accident, by just reading a lot of these historical experiments, among other things, is that in fact the Americans gradually rediscover nature, in the nature-nurture world on their own. And there is a kind, which I'll come to at the end, there is a kind of conversionary moment, if I can use my religious language, around 1970, where they begin to really just say, oh, you've got this great language, and to the Europeans, to Konrad Lorenz and others, you understand it, and they kind of act as if they've never heard of this before. But in fact, it's quite a gradual process. So what I'm trying to introduce is both the American agency and creativity, and the gradualism of the process, and also to say that probably there was no real nature-nurture war. that may be controversial. So here, if nothing else, this was a letter home written by the Calvin Perry Stone, who was a psychologist who taught at Stanford, to his family. And he was so irritated. He had never been abroad. He was quite provincial. I mean, amazingly provincial. Actually, he came from a really poor family, from a farming family. And in 1932, he had enough status, et cetera, at Stanford to go abroad. And he does a psychological grand tour. It's marvelous. He goes all around to all the labs and meets with people. But the people kept saying to him, in America, you're all behaviorists like Professor Watson, right? And the answer for his point of view is no. Stop asking me this question. So he's very irritated by that. There are some secondary points, and let me fly through these even more quickly. The first one is that, on the other hand, Americans didn't just concede that the Europeans had something, that the nature argument had something going for it. They don't just sort of say, oh, we were wrong to think that everything was learning and that intelligence was everything. They actually, there's a lot of argument. The Americans push back, and yet they're doing, in other words, it's kind of like a straw man. You know, their actual experiments, which I'll talk about in a minute, are going in the direction of looking at the body, of looking at emotion, of looking at nature in the largest sense. But the polemical literature is still going in the other direction. I guess my simple-minded sort of explanation of that is they didn't want to admit that they were wrong. So this is, in fact, one of the famous refutations of European animal science, arguing that it was wrong. But basically, there's a hiatus, there's a gap between what is being done in the lab, essentially, and what is being said. And I think that's very interesting, but not surprising. We all read, theoretical literature, and we all, have concrete information. And they didn't go in they didn't go in the same way. Let me just say, the other thing to say is that fields are really fluid. And here you have, again, Beach, who is a psychologist who ends up at Stanford but taught at Yale earlier on, who praises in 1981, looking back, by this time he's an old man, he praises psychology for becoming biologized. And says in America this happened, and in fact he was very interested in hormones. So for him this is a great thing. But basically I think the opposite happens as well. And you all, I know many of you are in scientific fields and can certainly tell me that I'm wrong among many other things. But I do think that American biology also becomes psychologized to some extent. In other words, what we would call behavioral subjects, enter into biology more and more. So it's no longer sort of a black and white situation, but there is a sort of change in the fields. And I, again, think that is something, worth thinking about. I wanted just to say briefly, to give you a sense of what animals were studied over all of these decades. Beach wrote a famous article in 1950, sort of castigating his fellow psychologists for having focused much as probably Lashley argued in 1918 for focusing too much on rats. So you have the Pied Piper of Hamelin here, the rat leading the psychologist down some garden path, which is not the right one. Too much focus on rodents. In fact, there are a lot of animals studied, and so this is actually not inclusive, but over the decades, and there's some truth to this, there's no question that to some extent rats became the primary lab animal in the United States. They were cheap, they were mammals, there was a lot of benefit to using rats. But basically in my study, including, for example, the social insects, raccoons are an interesting use or an interesting animal. Raccoons in the early years where they were trying to teach the animals to essentially get in or out of a cage. The raccoons were so good at it Like they had to redesign the cages. The rats, like if you had, like what you just saw, but if you had some little thing that the raccoon was going to tinker with, like they'd be out in a minute. So the person who worked with raccoons, had to design a harder cage. So there are all these different species that were studied, by the people I work on. Let me talk a little bit more about the history, as sort of a concrete experience. This is really flying through many decades. But I would argue that actually it's not a scientific, and this potentially controversial argument, it's not a scientific event that changes the direction so much as a human event. And the scientists are human beings, and Adele here I know is working on World War I, so you've got your World War I in here. But World War I is really transformational. There's a kind of, said in a bubblehead way, kind of a realization that human beings, and I suppose organisms in general, are not simply learning organisms, but there's more to it, and people started talking about, they didn't have words for it, but they talked about motivation, they talked about purpose, they talked about drives, they didn't want to use the word instinct, that was old-fashioned. But the war to exposing something of the complexity of organisms and specifically human nature was quite transformational. The other thing I'd say about this, though, is just about none of the people that I work on were very close to the war. And so they see it from a distance. They all see it from different viewpoints. The only person who actually went to the Western Front was Walter Cannon, who already in 1915 had published a book. So he's kind of positioned to appreciate emotion in the widest sense. But he had published a book based on 2 decades of experiments called Changes in Pain, Hunger, Fear, and Rage in 1915. And he goes to the Western Front. He goes with the Harvard physicians. They study wound shock. In other words, if you're wounded, like your body collapses. And he wanted to figure that out. But he's the only one who goes. And yet, as I'll show in the next slide, there is a great transformation of sort of intellectual orientation because others, in some ways, see what's going on. They soak it up. I use William Morton Wheeler on the right. He's on the far right over there. As a kind of counterexample, because he got in a boat in 1918, he went to Australia, and he studied ants. And yet, I think it was the same year, if I have the year correct, it's in the next slide, he gives a lecture called On Instincts. And so, in some ways, intellectually, they're living in the same world, and I would argue the world has something to do with the war. Let me start with the slide and then go back to this outpouring of publications that go along this new direction. This is just, again, an example. Edward Tolman, quite famous, active for decades, taught at Berkeley. But this is a different way of being in the war. He writes here to his brother, who was a physicist, and he says, awful things are happening here. Well, this is not the awful things of the Western Front. He was a pacifist. They were Quakers. And he lost his job at Northwestern because he had come out against the war. And he was not the only one. There were other scholars, too, who opposed the war, and personal things happened to them. So, in other words, the different ways you can be involved in the war and be affected by the war. But the consequence, and this is just a short list, in this single 2 years, there is just this outpouring of publications, and you can see some of the words in the publications. If you had intelligence and learning before, now you've got appetites and aversions, you've got purposiveness, which is another word, you've got on instinct, and there is this new vocabulary that sort of emerges, and it's very sudden. It's quite sudden. After the war, there is an experimental turn towards the body. Lashley, who I don't know if he's esteemed today. Actually, he wasn't a very nice person, among other things, but he was totally influential. Kind of leads this new direction into what I call here physiological psychology. Ironically, when they start performing, I'm going to say they're really lobotomies, but there are also other kinds of ablative surgeries. In other words, they cut out part or all of gonads and all these like surgeries. When they start doing that, what they're really looking for are the bodily or physiological foundations of intelligence. They want to know if you perform a lobotomy or do they still have memory. So they're looking at the old subject in that sense. Increasingly, though, once they look at the body, they begin to realize there are all these other things going on, including, sexuality and mood and temperament and other kinds of things. But he's very important, if for no other reason. He taught all of these people, and I'm assuming most of these names don't mean too much to you, but although if you're in the field, they probably mean something to you, but these are coming mostly from psychology. He taught all these other people how to do these surgeries. He actually learned from another person even earlier on, but they all start to do them. And so if nothing else, in terms of technique, he's very important. Interestingly, once emotion, and this is all sort of between the war kind of developments, once emotion sort of gets on the table, and there were other ways in which animals were altered physically in order to test learning and then increasingly look at emotion itself. There are other kinds of experiments that actually elucidate or bring out emotion that don't involve any physiological change. They don't involve surgery. So just to give two quick examples, some of these are rather hard reading. This one on the left isn't, but the one on the right's not so nice. In this experiment, again, famous open field experiments, rats are prey animals, and so the idea was if they were in a space with nowhere to hide that was lighted, they would be fearful. And I'm going to tell you how they measured fear. Probably some of you know this. They counted feces. They counted how many times they pooped to see how fearful they were. But basically, there's no physiological change. There's no experimental change. But it was clearly measuring fear and measuring emotion. In this, again, famous experiment, Norman Maier, this is a little nastier. This is one of the more hard to read. He's making the rats neurotic. What does he do? Well, he trains the rat that, if you have let's say a lighted circle and you jump through it, you're going to be able to go through the other side and maybe get a food reward. So the rat masters that. All of a sudden, like you put the block in back of this, and so the rat starts jumping at the circle, that has that the rat has been trained to jump at, and hits the wall. Not only that, but this is electrified. So the rat can't stand there. And so, again, calling it neurotic, but I would argue that there's a kind of emotional component to this, if nothing else. The study of emotion also goes forward rather accidentally. And one of the reasons, field work was not really much esteemed by psychologists, but this particular person, C. Ray Carpenter, who ended up with a job at Penn State of all things, so he left a lot of diaries, which I've read, and they're very interesting. His doctoral dissertation was doing surgical procedures on the gonads of pigeons. In relation to sexual behavior, but in the 1930s during the Depression, he couldn't get a job. So he got a whole lot of soft money jobs, and he ended up going all around the world and really viewing, towards the end of this period, they realized that they need primates for experiments, medical experiments. Not even psychological experiments. So he starts to build a breeding colony in Puerto Rico. But other things being equal, he observed primates in the wild, and he observed, among other things, sexual behavior. And yet it's kind of accidental. In fact, he was a student of Calvin Perry Stone, and in their correspondence, Stone keeps going, well, how come you're not getting a real job? And he's not very happy with him. He wants him to go back to the lab. And actually, Carpenter wanted to go back to the lab, too. But in the meantime, he had some very interesting experiences viewing animals in the wild. Let me say quickly that this is turning sort of another corner. wives and adult children were not only influential in the sense that they belonged to the families of scientists, but they actually contribute to the science. And the reason that I bring this up is not only because it's sort of, interesting in an anecdotal way, but I think they really shaped the science. In other words, between the wars anyway, the scientists, both, the male scientists who had the jobs and the females, really lost my train of thought. Really rolling along here. Let me go back. Oh, I know what I was going to say. They're very conventional nuclear families, and so the kinds of emotions that were considered to be important tended to be very, I'll call them again, kind of conventional. When Yerkes, for example, the husband, sees one of his primates, he's heard a story from one of his workers. One of the primates he was working with was involved in homosexual behavior. He says, oh, no, that's not possible. So the women, I'm not saying the women put a conservative kind of frame on this. What I am saying is the fact that the women were involved in a really foundational way is very important, and the science does show the consequences of that. This is not so important. This is more just to elucidate what this meant for the women. Ada Yerkes, brilliant woman. I've run into her words that I've seen in manuscripts at the at the Yale Archive, in her husband's publications. I mean, she was basically his ghostwriter. So for decades, she was really involved in his research, and yet she never has a job. And in some ways, you can see here, she was designing houses. You can see, if you can read her poem written in a diary, she said, my goal is to be a good wife. And so there is a kind of imbalance, and I'm going to say frustration in all of this, but it's very much part of the science. This is another example that will bring us back to the European-American kind of relationship. She's, again, a very important person in this field. But if the most important thing to see here is who wrote the foreword to her autobiography. And it's Konrad Lorenz. It's a European, naturalistic in that sense, on the nature-nurture side. She becomes involved in animal behavior, and observes song sparrows, but she never has a job. She's quite marginalized in the United States, and so she becomes, she becomes very important as a conduit between the Americans and the Europeans, because she isn't in the academy, I mean, to put it bluntly. She does a whole lot of things for them. You can see in this letter on the right, I don't know if you can read it very well, but basically she goes to bat for Lorenz after the war. She asks her friend, W.C. Alley at the University of Chicago, who is a biologist, to go to the Rockefeller Foundation and ask the Rockefeller Foundation to give him some money and maybe to bring him to the United States. He's a brilliant man. Actually, he was also a Nazi, as probably many of you know. He was a member of the Nazi Party. And Allie, who's a very straight arrow, kind of pushes her away. But she tries to help the Europeans, but intellectually she's a conduit. She also tries to help them in a very practical way. She organizes a circular letter after the war. She's going to send them food and so forth. But more important, she's going to send them reprints, books, and journals. And she never gave up. She's a marginal figure, but she obviously never gives up. There are emigre scientists who come to the United States, again, kind of playing with this European-American agency question that really flows through my project. These are, coming over the decades, some of the ones that I think are important. Several things to say about them. I think they were very important, actually. They were teachers of Americans. They did tend to be more theoretical as opposed to empirical. They bring a theorizing, in that sense, habit of mind, which is influential. On the other hand, almost all of them had various kinds of problems in the US. I wouldn't say that they were quite unwelcome, but they were not particularly welcome either. And I pulled out this quotation from this list of suggestions by Ernest Mayr, who ended up teaching at Harvard. He was German, to his friend, and Adele could probably help me, his Ukrainian geneticist who taught at Columbia, Theodosis Dobzhansky. Thank you. You know, and here among the comments on the paper is a lot of your tend to sound wrong to me. They kind of realized that they were outsiders, and they found each other. And they're very, you know, in that sense, a very productive relationship. But they did realize that they were outsiders. After the war, another European animal behaviorist thought about coming to the US, and Mayer writes to him and he says, you know, these Americans aren't very interested in what we do, meaning theory. And it was actually, for those who know, Nico Tinbergen, and Tinbergen doesn't come. So they have their own sort of world, but it is an important world. There are compromisers, and I'm moving quickly towards the end here. There were people who were able to find a middle ground. And it's just a long process. I mean, I guess that's what history is all about, right? Long, gradual process. And I would say Frank Beach is one of them. He seemed to be a moderate man. If you look at this, you'll see he was interested in both the body, biology. At the end of his life, actually, in the latter part of his life, he became really focused on hormones and behavior. This is 1948. He lived to the 1980s, but he becomes increasingly so. But basically, also running through this is a very strong emphasis on evolution. And American behaviorists were not known to be evolutionary, but in fact, he was very evolutionary. So again, there's a sort of misperception about American behavioral science. Where does evolution show up? You know, you have play in animals. This was a lecture he gave, psychosomatic phenomena in animals. He gave the lecture at Cornell in 1950, and he sort of apologized. He said, well, do animals have psychosomatic, you know, symptoms? But yes, I mean, he argues yes. Early experience, childhood, you know, it just very much an evolutionary view with biology and also learning. The illustration at the right, which is not terribly important in itself, but actually it compares lactation in cows and mothers, human mothers, you know, based on disruption. In other words, if you disrupted cows frightened by a loud noise, he says over there. You know, so he was a very strict evolutionist, probably too much so. But basically, he does find a kind of middle ground. Last slide. And what is interesting, though, is the middle ground sort of emerges. But, you know, in the 1970s, you have multiple both psychologists and biologists. And actually, one thing I didn't say about Beach, I mean, he's trained as a very conventional psychologist, but he gave a talk or a lecture in 1966, one of the citations I have there, where he calls himself a biologist. And you think, well, what do you mean? Like, you're not a biologist, you're not trained that way, you're trained in behavior, and yeah, you're interested in hormones. But he feels that he's gone over. This is another, just one example. Over and over again around the 1960s or 1970s, they say to the Europeans, and this is one of them, which include Konrad Lorenz, Nico Tinbergen, and Karl von Frisch, who, as many of you know, together, all three of them won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for their work on animal behavior and the natural basis of animal behavior in 1973. And he actually, again, the papers are incredible in terms of his relationship with von Frisch over many decades. But there are these conversionary sorts of, I hate to use the religious language, but basically they don't really change. In other words, the American foundation, I would argue, in empiricism, I guess I'll call it the glory of American, life science, really continues. And yet intellectually, they say what they call, I haven't used the word, but ethology, which is the natural science of animal behavior. They say ethology is great. They point out inherited patterns of communication and action, which is, very European. In other words, they adopt a language. So the theory and the language all of a sudden seem to make sense to these very empirical Americans, and there is this kind of conversionary moment. And I guess from that point, you're going to go forward. So I think that, again, I'm going to conclude and just say, I'm the historian, and I think, I'm not a scientist, but I would hope that there's some value in pointing out that things were not always as they are now. That things change very slowly, and they change for a combination of reasons. It may seem that in some ways I'm arguing that there was a lot of accident in this. I mean, some of it is accidental, but I think there are other components. One of the components is really careful watching. I mean, what I'm going to call, again, empiricism. In other words, I think all of these people are incredibly good scientists. And so they would, set up an experiment one way, let's say to study intelligence, and all of a sudden they'd be finding something else. And I could point out articles, again and again. It's like, I'm studying this, but wow, this is really interesting too. So in that sense, they're good scientists. And finally, I was going to say intellectual openness. It's not just the looking, but even though to some extent I would argue they go kind of kicking and screaming, in this kind of direction, which is a middle ground, I would argue, between, traditional learning experiments and animal emotions and nature nurture. I think that there's a kind of middle ground today. They're not happy about it. They don't admit they're wrong. They don't want to say, well, we studied intelligence, but, and there's nothing else in the world. If you're John B. Watson, that's what you're saying. There's nothing else in the world. But the vast majority of them, who were not so high profile, have this liberal spirit. They say, okay, these other people have a point too. And it may take a few decades, but eventually, they say, good. So thank you very much.